We're just going to wait a minute for everyone to switch over.
Oh, sure.
That's stupid that you have to enable Q&A before you start, that you can't do it while you're broadcasting. Oh, yeah. That's a fact. All right, 2 people on their way. Sorry about that, everybody. We'll get it down. Yeah, I was trying to get the Q&A enabled, Darren, and killed the broadcast accidentally. So we're gonna move on with the presentation once everybody's back. Yes, I'm eating an apple. I'm sorry. All right, only 3 people are over here, so let's wait a minute. All right, we're up to 5. That's good. I think we had 7, so we'll wait 1 more second. There is, Misha, there is Q&A. Some people have already asked a couple questions. You might need to click on a Q&A tab on the left side of the video screen, and that should be able to bring you to Q&A. On the grid?
Yeah, it's a little Rubik's Cube side.
She said it's on the Rubik's Cube thing. Oh, there we go. Much better. Bob says, thank you for the upgrade. You are welcome. Okay. Let's get started.
All right, everybody. I'm Dan, so thanks for watching, those of you that are online. So the name of my article was Toward Understanding the Effects of Cross-Cultural Schemata and Discourse Structure on Second Language Reading Comprehension. So I thought it was really interesting. It looked at a lot of different studies. So what I tried to pick out for my presentation was just sort of some important parts from all of those studies that I thought were worth highlighting. There's a lot more research that should be done in this area, so the study should be expanded, is one thing that I really got out of this. Especially studies more in depth with children. A lot of these studies that we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes here will be studies particularly that were done on adults, but there was one that was done on children. But really, it really stressed the importance of the expansion of the studies and saying that we need more research and as technical communicators, bridging that gap of, connecting the language barriers between cultures is really something that we can get out of this. So to move on, understanding the articles. So again, this is just kind of an overview. The article was composed of various studies in regards to studying reading comprehension and comparison to native and non-native speaking groups with regard to information processing and understanding. So the studies looked at cultural variables in these studies with relation to learning how to read and cultural backgrounds. So the interpretation of all these studies looked at some of the different cultures and some of the barriers, again, that people from those cultures had when trying to learn the information in a second language, especially when some of the variables of the non-native language weren't known. Some of the subjects resorted back to certain variables from their own culture. So that was interesting to look at the patterns of what different cultures kind of did to try to compensate for not knowing either the understanding in reality of what the translation really was in the non-native language, or what they used to kind of bridge that gap. So again, the studies were looking at ESL and various schemata associated with that. Language. So the cultural schemata and language factors are crucial components of the reading process in a first and second language. That was one thing that jumped out at me. Specific linguistic and cultural differences can affect learning to read. That was something that was mentioned as well. So what is the goal of this? So an important goal is cross-cultural comprehension research can contribute to our understanding of the reading process in a first and second language. So understanding that gap and further research is important. We're going to look at some of the specific studies. For those of you that read that article, Flores and Huddleston, these particular studies showed that language differences, although influential when learning to read a second language, do not necessarily limit reading performance. And in these studies, they also found that language proficiency can be enhanced through the reading process as well. So just kind of some important aspects of those studies. Johnson was another study that was done, and in this particular study, it was found that readers recalled more of the propositions from a familiar versus an unfamiliar portion of a text. And so some of these studies are a little different than each of the others. Then there was also another one by Hudson. And this study on ESL students found and provided further evidence supporting the claim that second language reading is an interactive process. So that was an important milestone in the Hudson study. And what do all these studies share together? All of these ESL studies show the interactive nature of second language reading, and that schemata, context, and language are considered critical variables in a model of first and second language reading. Also, such studies should further be expanded to include children groups for study, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then just a little bit more in regards to ESL studies. Many second language learners try to compensate for the limitations, again, like I'd mentioned, in second language knowledge by relying on their content schemata. Instructional practices that bridge the cultural knowledge gap between the native culture of the reader and the new cultural information in the text should be implemented. Strategies that build the background knowledge and interrelate the schemata with text are crucial. And then again, so we're going to want more studies and research, more studies with children, and then specifically what was mentioned was elementary school children, so that age range. And then more studies should be done with language study as well, such as looking at culturally specific and linguistically variant thought discourse patterns and the influence on second language reading comprehension. And then any questions for the class?
I have a question. You
Yes.
said you loved this article.
Yes.
What did you love about it? You should step over here into the
Oh,
middle.
sure, sorry. Part of what I loved about this article was that it really looked at a lot of the barriers that each of the cultures had. So like each specific study had some kind of interesting point, you know. One of them mentioned that certain subjects were able to, you know, look at data from their own culture and relate that more to memorizing certain things in order. Another study just basically studied the effects of just the other variables on the reading comprehension in general. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting to look at how they all kind of found something that was a gap in the cultural communication between the cultures. So I think that as technical communicators, being able to make sure that some of these gaps are looked at in more detail is something that I kind of got out of it. And so, you know, looking at one of the studies in particular, I'm trying to find one that would be a good example here. So one of the studies looked at some of the cultural backgrounds, and this basically said that it really had to do with the processing strategies of one culture over another. So like English and the Japanese, for example, were one that looked at expository processing. And so the English and the Japanese have different discourse patterns, so they interpret the information differently. And so that was, I mean, there's kind of a lot of information that went into each of these studies. So trying to just kind of get out of it that there was always some kind of a barrier that was hit in each of these studies and in the recall. So trying to find better ways to do the training when teaching the language, trying to find out what patterns are kind of happening regularly. Those would be things that we would want to study more. And then, so, you know, again, wanting to expand on the study with students, particularly younger age groups.
So why do you think this is assigned on Translation Week?
Why is it assigned on Translation Week? Probably because we need to get better at translation.
True.
I have an answer. Come on, Dana, you got this.
Well, because we need to learn more about that, right? We need to learn more about translation.
What's your answer?
I approached it thinking more about the cultural discourse and schemas that people already come with as readers and writers. So when you make the translation week, you have to think about their art ideas already in place, how they're going to process the text.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. So we're looking at we keep reading about what translators do to texts to make them more understandable for cultures, and this is more about the reader perspective of who's coming to the text. But there's stuff you can do. Do you think does that article give us hope? There's stuff we can do.
Yeah, I mean, this article was a whole bunch of studies, and so that, I mean, it gives us hope. But one thing that it says here is that instructional practices which bridge the cultural knowledge gap between the native culture of the reader and the new cultural information in the text should be implemented. Strategies which build background knowledge and interrelate schema with text are crucial. So
Yes.
in that regard, I mean, compared with what you said, yes, it's hopeful.
Good.
You know, so, but there was a lot to this article, so I had to read it a few times. And then I kind of tried to look at all the different studies and what the problems were that they ran into and where a technical communicator would fit in that. regard to help bridge that gap. And so I think that, yeah, it was a good article. So for those of you that read it, hopefully you kind of saw some of those gaps as well. And that's about it. So
Yay!
very good. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, internet folks. So I think, let's see, someone was answering some stuff over here. Because we don't write documents with translation in mind from the very start. Translation always seems like an afterthought. Oh, and he wants to know, do you think some of those gaps could be addressed with a better understanding of our old friend, contrastive rhetoric?
Yes. Yes. Dan says yes.
What do you guys think?
I think it's a decent starting point, but again, we already know the limitations of contrastive rhetoric, is that we're already using kind of English thinking and linear processing as our benchmark.
Darren said you did an excellent job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
The answer to your question, I think that's Jim talking here. J-M-E.
J-M-E.
I think the answer was, yeah, somewhat.
Somewhat,
Yeah.
I still don't think it's a completely invalid thing. I think what we learned last week from Connor's article is we just have to be a little more, tread more lightly with how we're going to use it and think about things.
So do you guys want to talk about the paper next, or should I do a lecture next? I think some people were saying something about the paper on here. I'm gonna log back into this, hold on. Do you guys have questions about it?
About the paper?
Our market study.
Yeah.
I had one coming in and I put it down.
I think I was just more concerned about the limit, like the 1,500 or
Yeah, I'm trying to not be-
or being more
Precise
and
where A,
I mean, if you give it to me in a PDF that doesn't have easy word count, and I'm not going to copy and paste it into a Word document or something. So,
are you saying
I just make everything a PDF, so it doesn't have to be bad.
and then when you read, you can't see the spelling mistakes, right? Like
That's true.
it's a rhetorical move. Well, let's see if there's other questions up here while I get this set up.
do we only see questions when you, like,
I don't know.
because I'm not seeing any, like, I'm just seeing when people say, like, got it, nice job.
I think you see the
Like, answered question.
answered question. So when they're popping up for me, you don't see them while they're when they're asked. Maybe I don't really know because I don't know the.
So I looked at the question. Oh, there's a question. Oh, Alicia asked a question.
Someone wanted to know what article that you were doing.
Me?
I think so.
It is called, I can type it on, I'm not in the thing, but it was a really long title.
Looks like someone just answered it.
Oh, okay.
Towards understanding the effects of cross-cultural community discourse structure. It's a long title.
Janelle, it's this one.
It's this.
23 pages.
Look at it.
Structure, someone said. Okay, so here's a question. I was thinking about the Grimm folktale versus Apache folktale study. It seemed like the study could be biased because not only were there American students familiar with the structure of Grimm, but I thought they were possibly familiar with the tale itself.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Because you as a child, you probably heard a Grimm's fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
whereas very little exposure to the Native American folklore. You may have some exposure to it in school.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have an opinion? So a lot of people were questioning that, and they admitted some bias
Some
in
bias, yeah.
it. I also thought that as we're all going to be ethically minded technical communicators, something you need to think about, and we've talked a couple of times about Native American culture and how it's been sort of co-opted and then taken away. So the amount of Grimm fairy tales an American student hears growing up, I don't think is translatable, no pun intended, to how often Native Americans experience their folklore, because I mean, I think they made an assumption that each culture would hear the folk tales the same amount, but I don't know if you can necessarily say that. But it was pretty dubious, I thought. So let's see here. The Barnett's file, someone said yes. So Misha, I think that's a really good point, and I love that we're picking stuff out in the reading that you're like, I don't know about that. I don't totally buy that, because as you all have master's degrees in this now, that's part of the higher education, is being having a healthy dose of skepticism.
Well, and I like it, I think it's fun to see just the citations and the years of the studies, and granted that the
Sure.
studies were taking place 2 or so years before the published date,
Right.
but then just how things have evolved and thinking about how to set up studies.
I don't know if you guys can hear that, but she was remarking about the years, particularly I think in Dan's article.
Yeah.
Since it was the overview of the studies. And you could see that in the early 80s, this kind of exploded, this interest in translation and contrastive rhetoric. And the only stuff that's been done recently is either critiques or moving it into the electronic age, which is kind of the hot thing right now to talk about. And next week we do more machine translation stuff, which I don't know if that stood out to anybody, but I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk more about that next week too. So Darren wanted to talk about the paper, I thought, and now no one's posting any questions. So I guess I'll give my quick little lecture. The stuff this week was pretty straightforward, I thought. There's not going to be as much to talk about, but until somebody starts posting some questions about the paper. All right. So you have a link to my Zoho thing. Actually, I wonder if I can access it on here. My presentation. Hang with me for a second here. Oh, dang it. Internet people. If there's other questions, we can post them and talk about them. But I think the one thing, especially about your issue, Dan, or your article, is to think about is that it's not only a matter of translating the words accurately. Like, I hope that's the takeaway, because there's tons of cultural influences in the reader and the writer and the medium, and so the perfect translation, the elusive perfect translation. So I'll try and share my screen. That's what I'm going to try and do. This might freak the video out for a minute. Oh, here we go. Well, this is going to be lovely. This is going to work very well. Okay. So I think everybody can see my presentation. Oh, you guys probably still need to see it though, huh? Whatever. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen here, and you folks can see it behind. Oops. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk, I'm just going to do a sort of brief overview of a few things and then talk about a couple concepts that that I thought the text didn't really get into. So the first thing that we, you need to think about when you think about translation, in addition to the stuff we've read, because I don't want to cover it again, is the idea of sub-languages. So there's all sorts of different sub-languages that you'll run into when you're looking at translation, and translating from, English to Chinese is one sub-language issue that you have to deal with, but there's other kinds of translation that you're going to have to do. One of them that's pretty common, if not as common as translating for a different language, is the idea of specialized fields of knowledge. So translating something from engineers to some documents from engineers to PR people or something like that. You might prepare documents for translation that way. And you'll probably always have a little bit of that when you're doing translation, because if you're translating from an English version of an engineer to a South African version of an engineer, you're going to have some overlaps in what their lexical, grammatical, and syntactic features are. So you'll probably, no matter what type of translation you'll be doing, you'll be looking at the specialized fields of knowledge of your audience in some capacity. So that's one type. Of course, the linguistic experience, which you can rely on contrastive rhetoric and embodied cognition, which was talked a little bit about in the articles this week, which I'll go into a little bit more. It's not as old of a theory as contrastive, although it could be argued that it's as old as time, but it's not as old of a theory as contrastive rhetoric, so there's not as much on it. And then regional issues, something that came up even this week. We're hiring a new professional communication professor, and somebody was talking about health marketing campaigns, and she was saying, like, for example, the United States versus Africa, and one of the other professors just kind of started laughing, and he said, people always say Africa is as if it's this thing that you would write something for, where and inside of Africa, there's as drastic of differences amongst different cultures than there is between Africa and the United Kingdom, So there's regional issues that you need to look at when you're doing this translation. And I think it was the So You Want to Work in China article this week talked about that, that in any time or place in China, there's not going to be one way that you can translate something for all Chinese people, because a lot of it's agrarian, a lot of it's rural, a lot of China's in the city, a lot of it's on the cusp of technology, and a lot of it is at the far reaches behind in technology. So it's not like you can just say, well, China is X, and I will prepare a document for China. If it's going to take you a year maybe to get something out, a lot will have changed. And so it's not like you have to create a different, let's say you're making a different brochure for every single province. If you're, let's say, in Canada, you don't need to create something different for everything, but you need to be careful of saying, okay, this type of document can be translated in this way for Africa, right? Because that's going to be your failure when it doesn't take hold in a lot of the regions, right? So you could be more realistic and say, well, these parts are more urbanized, so this thing would work, but sending out a link to a web page isn't going to work for all of Africa, right? So regional issues are going to be something, and it depends on how localized the issue is. If you're simply translating something into German, you might not have the opportunity to study a particular locale because it's going to all of Germany or anybody who speaks German. So, but it's something to think about when you're relying, especially on any contrastive rhetoric issues. There's also genre translation. So if you're looking at something that's informational, commercial, contextual, or technical, are usually the four areas that TechCom and translation specialists focus on. Informational's usually the big one. Commercial's usually the best paying one. So you need to be aware, especially if you're translating for commercial purposes, what the standards are for commercial material in that language or something like that, because you'll run into information. So does that make sense? Different sub-languages that you could translate for. Yeah.
Can you talk more about what the embodied definition is?
Yeah, I have a slide on it.
Okay.
It just so happens. It just so happens. Oh, someone asked the question about the marketing report now, but
Mr. Chance.
yeah, I'll come back to that. Okay, so I think there's a lot of lag. So here's a few tenets, and I put this up here because these are in addition to what your texts talk about, and these can be found in a lot of the standard literature. If you really wanted to specialize in translation, you would find these. But here's some of the tenets of good translation, things you need to think about. Clarity, obviously, you need to be as clear as possible. Oh,
I was just gonna ask.
I forgot you guys weren't seeing my screen. So obviously clarity, you need to be clear. I think that should be the first thing you're concerned about. Terminology management, you need to, if you go into translation, you'll be coordinating multiple people translating multiple documents. So you need to make sure that the terminology you use is the same in each version for each document, as well as terminology management of your reader and audience and the company you're preparing translation for. So you need, and they talk about this a little bit in the reading, when you have, when you pay by the word for translation, you need to make sure you're not calling one thing two different words. Space and signposts, you want to make sure you have signposts continually through your work. Something like, even things like, signposts really go beyond things like headers, but those would be considered signposts as well. But if you have a section that has 5 paragraphs in it, then you're going to make 5 points. You want to say, the first point is this, the second point is this, blah, 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 because if you're going into translating into a language that uses a different organizational style or conceptual style of how they process information, the signpost will help keep them on track, even if they're not familiar with the whatever style of writing you're doing, if you're doing linear style, right? So as many signposts as you can make, the easier it is for other people to understand it, regardless of what if they're circular or whatever the other things are. Cultural and rhetorical differences, and Dan's article really got at this. There's different ways of making arguments. There's different ways of understanding things. There's cultural references that will not translate. So you need to be very cautious with any cultural patterns or norms or anything like that in the document that you're preparing to be translated. Think about the translator as well as the reader. So when you prepare a document for translation, it goes to a translator first, right? Unless you happen to know the language. And so think about how the translator is going to be able to read and look at your document. Your only audience isn't just the reader, it's also the translator. Glossaries, you want to have glossaries in the text. You want to have glossaries for the people working on the different texts. They're very important. Space, space is in there twice. So space apparently is doubly important. Space is talking about when let's say you have a book for translation and it's 100 pages and it needs to be 100 pages no matter which language it's in. So you have to be very economical with how you use the page. You have to be economical with how you space things, paragraphs and ideas, and how you put in charts and graphs and pictures, and how the layout looks on the page. It seems far away, but when you're doing translation, space can be a really big issue. So then there's the 2 different types of analyses you should be doing on your documents when you're working on them, or at least identify which type that you are striving for. So conceptual or textual analysis. Do you want someone to be able to read and understand every word of what you're writing, or do you need people to be able to get the concepts from what you're talking about? And that can change where you put your time and energy when you're preparing stuff for translation. If you're preparing a medical document and it's very important that the information be exact, then you need to think about that when you're writing and doing your signposts and things like that. If it's maybe an informational document about vacation spots or something, the concepts may be more important too. And then you can focus on other uses of your time rather than making sure point A to B to C to D are followed in that order, right? So they're probably both always going to be there to some extent, but some will be highlighted more than others. Sorry. Oh, someone said, if you're into this stuff and looking for potential career field, Joyce from Frederickson Communications says there's a huge need for translation and local managers in e-learning. Great potential to be a rare expert in a growing field. That's a really interesting point. Misha, well done. Yeah, that's a very good point. So check that out. Strategies. One thing that I don't think was stressed enough in the readings we had for this week is that you should always have a bigger strategy going into any translation project. That it lay it out, your style guide as that one, or whatever you're going to be using. But you want to go in with a clear idea of what you're translating for, what you're focusing on, what you're highlighting, what the rules are, what terms you're using, what glossary you're using, all of those things, because figuring them out as you go will work for some things in translation, but you need an overarching strategy for it. And then the last two things that I found that I thought were sort of interesting. Pronoun references are extremely difficult for translating between languages. So I know it seems like a small thing, but that's something you want to avoid if you can, avoiding pronouns, because it really changes the order of the sentence. And can get confusing. And then sentence length, keeping sentences short as possible while still getting the meaning across. It might not be beautiful writing, but it will at least be able to translate. So any questions about the tenets before I move on? And you could probably spend a weekend searching and find twice as many. And if you go into translation, you'll probably want to do that. So a comment about space from Annie. Makes me think of learning Russian in high school, the English hello and the Russian, you guys can't see it, but it's a long word, will take up very different amounts of space. So that's they said, translating from English to another language, you can expect a 20 to 30% increase in space. And so that's definitely something you need to think about. That's an interesting point, Annie. This is kind of cool. I like this. Okay. So next we have Heliana's embodied cognition. Embodied cognition, it's kind of like one of those concepts like contrastive rhetoric that's easy to understand at first, but then takes forever to really understand. The premises are that the human mind is largely reliant on the human body. Reasoning, judgment, perception are impacted by one's situatedness and environment. Now, that might sound good and fine, but as we talked about a couple weeks ago, something like reasoning, which is thought to be universal and makes sense no matter what language you're using in what culture, but if A then C, or if A then B then B then C, or whatever, that type of thought pattern in embodied cognition is called into question. So it links the mind and the body in a way that for us, for what we're doing, matters, because words will always have different contexts, and it's kind of what we've been talking about all semester without ever labeling it embodied cognition. But this idea that your environment really truly impacts every part of how you think and why you think and what you think. I put robotics on here because embodied cognition is used as the standard for how to make, they're using it to make the best AI. Like they just had the robot that passed the Turing test, and they're using embodied cognition by kind of like a Roomba. Like the Roomba senses the things around it and then is able to adapt. And so the only thing a Roomba thinks is like vacuum, right? Or suck, if you were gonna say the Roomba was thinking. But it's able to adapt based on its sensory perceptions. And so when they're making super complex robots at MIT and things like that, they use embodied cognition as sort of the highest standard. So if you can, as a robot, can judge your face and respond appropriately based on the reaction it's getting, that's sort of, it's not thinking, I'm delivering this message, I should look stern. It's looking, exactly, it's responding to the environment, it's responding to the people next to, in front of it. And so it's always this simultaneous thought, act, respond, or thought, act, sense, respond. Again, it might not be that mind-blowing because we've been talking about it all semester, but there's huge fields of literature and scholarship on embodied cognition that are really interesting. The one thing that really will come into play for you with translation is thinking about conceptual metaphors, by which, I'm trying to think of one. I had one before class, now I can't remember. The ship plowed through?
Or, yeah, this idea that the metaphor, when you say something plows through, or,
Okay.
it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good one. You're like plowing through something, like, oh yeah, I plowed through that stack of papers last night or anything.
But if someone were to read that and think about that, what are using plot, like,
Yeah, you would think plow.
plow.
Right. Exactly. So conceptual metaphors and translation could be a huge problem because there's not that same experience with the environment. Okay, so how might this impact the translatability of a text? We kind of talked about that. And we're not all here to discuss it, so we'll see. Okay, then there's deconstruction. Deconstruction, for the purposes of what we're doing here, isn't all that important, but it is an important concept in rhetoric and technical communication. So in deconstruction, there's no ultimate secure meaning in a text language, that was a mistake, or words. And think for a moment about like what that means. Like there's no meaning in text, language, or words. A word doesn't ever have a secure meaning. Like Derrida is famous for putting his terms under erasure as a way to point out that they don't really exist. So he'd put a line through his text, right? Or through a word, because it's always being called into question and it never means that the real intent doesn't exist. And it's always,
everything comes together at that moment. And you use it.
Right, exactly.
When you leave it,
Then it's meaningless
Yeah.
again. Now, that said, we still read his stuff and understand it in our own way, maybe not the way he intended, but meaning happens. So anyway, deconstruction. Gender, racial, economic, political, cultural issues infect all text. I like that idea that they infect everything. So every word is infected with political and cultural issues. Every text is infected. Language has historically been used to dominate other cultures through the definition of nature. Think in-group, out-group. This is one of the most important parts of deconstruction, is this ethical component that language is used to dominate other cultures. And so, like, you think of the English-only movements, and so that's happening at a micro level every day. The fact that I teach this class only in English says something and keeps certain people from taking it, and at least for deconstructionists, that's what they would think. It's very much about keeping an out group. And it refutes truth in any capacity. There cannot be truth because it's all experiential and embodied. All knowledge, all ideas nothing exists independently. I'm not saying that this is right, but this is deconstruction. So I like this quote. I thought it was very deconstruction-y. The multiplicities and contingencies of human experience necessarily bring knowledge down to the local and specific level and challenge the tendency to centralize power through the claims of an ultimate truth which must be accepted and obeyed by all. I thought that was sort of the most pointed description of the political, economic, cultural issues that deconstruction talks about. So if you think about it, our experience necessarily brings knowledge down to our level. And that's sort of what we're getting at with a lot of the translation stuff and a lot of the stuff that we've been doing with cultures, is that it's very local specific. It's not this centralized power. It's not trying to bring in truth to this other culture. It's just coexisting, I suppose. So deconstruction is weird. So here's some things to think about. You can consult this list. Maybe we can add to it later in the semester, of things that are marked as being in the periphery of texts that are prepared for translation that technical communicators are often guilty of overlooking. So things that are in parentheticals, backgrounds, background pictures or watermarks, colors. Colors have particular cultural meanings that need to be thought about. The organization of text, icons, skippability. So skippability is like what you're going to skip because you don't think it's necessary when you're translating a text, which happens all the time. People often skip icons when they're translating because they're not thinking about what icon, or they just put in an icon, but it means something totally different in that culture, but they're textual translators, right? So they don't think about that. So that's something good translators, technical communicators do. They think about that. Terms, again, we talked about glossaries, making sure the terms mean the same thing, or at least that there's a way that the audience can access what the term means in this context. Styles, and that means like style guides and how you cite information changes depending on the cultures. What images are culturally appropriate, what genre from earlier are you working in, what are the connotations of the word, words that probably is one of the biggest ones. Your example of post I thought was excellent. So it's very clear what post you're using if you like, I don't know, said, now I can't think of a sentence that has post in it. Yeah, okay, so post the letter, right? Like we would get it, but does that mean, yeah, standing both? Or does that mean like that you're gonna do something after the letter? Or like, yeah, exactly. So maybe even in English that's confusing. But if there's certain connotations to words or certain words that are deemed problematic, like I think of our Institute for Community Engagement and Scholarship is ISIS. So we all day talk about ISIS all the time, you know, and that has a very different connotation now than it did when they changed the name 3 years ago. Also humor, the stuff I read on this, humor never translates, so don't use it. There's not even like a guide for how to make it translate, it just doesn't. So don't do humor. Also somebody said they want Annie to do her next presentation in Russian. I see there's a lot of questions up here. I'm not answering them right now about the market report, but I'll get to them. So I found this, I just thought it was really interesting, not so much for what you guys can't see that, for what it's saying, but for, oh, you guys can see that either. Sorry, those were all there. So I don't think that I don't think the knowledge in this thing that I found is very interesting, but I think the idea of making this checklist for yourself, if you were to start doing some translation, does the text use easily understandable words? What words might cause difficulty? Make a list. Does the text rely on idioms? Does the text avoid humor? Start making this checklist for yourself as you're going through documents, and adding to it, I think is a really interesting idea. Okay, so here's some stuff that I think we should, thank you. That I think we should ask ourselves before, I probably won't do a translation project. So you folks should ask yourself before getting into a translational project. What technical skills do you need? Do you need to learn about solar energy before undertaking this project, at least a basic understanding, which by no means is something you can't do. As technical communicators, you are absolutely equipped to learn the basics of almost any field to be able to do your work. I'm fully confident in that. I had to learn a lot about, quantum physics to do my dissertation. something I never thought that I would ever learn. I can't barely do multiplication, but I know quite a bit, especially about the history of quantum physics. It's really odd. And you all can do that too. So, okay. What information do I need about the culture and the translator? Meet the translator if you can, find out about what processes they use, market study analysis, the culture you're going to be translating for, if it is a specific culture, if it's a language, find out what issues you might have with that. So those are some questions you can ask. Are there similar projects you can use as a model? Use your network, look at the STC, the Society for Science and Technical Communicators. There's going to be people who published on translation for X. So you can look at that and see what happened and see what roadblocks they found out. Like doing a minimal amount of research up front can save you a lot of time. Who's the audience? What's the purpose of the document? Usability testing your translated document, I think, is one of the best things to think about. I don't know if it was something I read or you guys read, but translating something into the language and then back into English and seeing if you can still understand it. That is one of the best tests for if your translation is successful. Quantum physics, good Lord, I agree. If anybody's interested about techno-feminism, I have the best stuff for you to read. Okay. And what are the gaps? They talk in the reading, they talk about gaps between languages that just don't have anything. Or Dan, you talked about this too, like that there's nothing you can do. There's a gap there, so you're going to have to figure something out. There's a gap between culture. Look, this culture and this culture, they do not use the same ideas for sentence construction. So there's a gap. There's nothing you can do. What's your plan for overcoming that gap and figuring out what the gaps you're going to run into in that language or in that culture? Derrida would say footnotes, but oh, dang it.
Let's have conversations within our footnotes about the not structural.
So give me 1 second here because this thing is not working. Let's see if I can Google this. I know you guys can't see this, but so let's see here. We'll do this. Hold on. Hello, everybody. We're gonna get up to BuzzFeed here.
It's Friday the 13th.
I know. I'm going to a wedding on Friday the
Did
13th.
they purposely plan it for Friday the 13th or
that's a
just
good
worked
question.
out?
Maybe. They have the worst luck I think people I've ever met, so.
Well, let us know how it goes.
Yeah.
Okay, the internet isn't working on this computer. Hold on, everybody.
Oh, I know.
You
It's something
You get
all
one
the
thing and then
quizzes.
you're like.
Yeah.
Do you think you could run the mouse up here while I run the mouse over here? Yes. Jeez. Oh, I thought you were mad. Okay. Okay. Hold on. Okay. So here's something kind of fun. I know it's a BuzzFeed article, so it's kind of stupid, but I thought it was interesting to think about, and it's a little campy too. Like it sort of romanticizes other languages, but still kind of interesting. So these different words that are untranslatable in English. So just going to go through a couple of these. So feeling homesick for a place you've never been to. This really gets into the Sapir-Whorf stuff that we were talking about too. I think I've said that word. I feel homesick for Florida or something. I've been to Florida, but I think I've felt that feeling before, even though I didn't have a language. So the next one, having one leg that's shorter than the other.
Like the pig leg one.
I know. The next one, this Inuit word for the frustration of waiting for someone to show up. Like, oh my gosh, right?
That is a word for it.
I know. So Tingo, to gradually steal all the possessions out of a neighbor's house by borrowing and not returning. So the ultimate Homer Simpson, right? Taking all the Ned Flanders stuff. Yeah, I like this one too. The scattered light through the trees.
Oh.
Isn't that beautiful? The act of leaving a book unread after buying it, typically piling it up together with other unread books. Very guilty of that. There's an Office episode that's like, oh, have you read that book? Read it. I own it.
Yeah,
But no, I haven't read it.
Yeah.
The feeling of being alone in the woods. A wordless yet meaningful look shared by two people who both desire to initiate something but are reluctant to start. Like, that is a complex concept in English, right?
If you really get your facial recognition
Very Henry Louise.
Yeah, exactly. A face badly in need of a fist. Let's see. A person who asks too many questions. I like that quite a bit. So, okay, so you can stop going through them now. So this list is up there, and you guys can check them out if you want. But I thought that was sort of interesting, just with what we were reading this week. That came across my.
Well, it's neat because it demonstrates that other cultures have kind of a more expansive experience in their terms, that they are very, like the light through the woods.
Right.
You know, that somebody at some point thought of that.
Right. So you can see.
Incorporate that into their.
Yeah, and you can see how that would change your experience.
Yeah.
If you had a word for that, or a word for the frustration of waiting, for someone to show up. And there's a lot of them in there that I'm kind of like, I've never been able to quite put my finger on that before, but I know I've felt that feeling. So we'll transition now to talking about the market report. I don't have a sample of the market report. I just don't. I haven't taught this class before. I don't have approval to take students from other classes' marketing reports and give them to you. I tried to find one, but I could not. So it's not that I'm trying to be mean and keep the form away from you, but I just literally don't have one. So that's going to answer 90% of the questions people have for this. I'm more than happy to have you email it to me, and I will say, that looks awesome, or that looks like the furthest thing from what I was expecting. I really think that by not having an example, you guys will come up with better stuff anyway. If I gave you one, I'd get 15 of them that look the same, which isn't helpful anyway. But I really, again, I'm sorry, but I just literally don't have one. So
Graphics are okay.
not only okay, I definitely want you to use graphics. Yep. Or a chart or something. Yep.
So if we do go with the, keeping a persona in the back of our head, do you want us to put that anywhere at the top, like what we thought about, or do you have to?
So this question has been asked, I think, every week. So let me repeat the question. It's a good question. It's dealing with the persona. So how you talk about the persona in the actual marketing report. I think if you're going to use a persona, like let's say you're Scotland and you're thinking about technology, you can put it in one sentence. This marketing report would be appropriate for someone who is looking into the demographics of technology in Scotland or something like that. I think one sentence in the first paragraph, and then, because I think I kept answering, well, like, oh, you don't have to, you can. Let's just say if you're using an angle, which you all are, one sentence in the introduction, unless you've already done something different, that's fine too. But one sentence in the introduction saying, this marketing report is appropriate for blank. Does that make sense? Yeah, format, style, visual references available. Again, I think the best thing for you to do is send it to me and have me look at it. And then if you are really worried that you're off base. Also know in your hearts that I'm not going to give you an F because it doesn't look like how I wanted it to look, because I don't know how these should look. This is my first time doing this. So it's not like I'm gonna be holding you to some standard that you don't have access to. So Misha, I'm gonna mark your question as answered, even though that might not have been answered enough for you. So we can see that. So Bob asked if we need to include regional issues in the market study. Don't know what you mean by that. So if you can add another question in there to clarify. And so different regions within the country. Yeah, I mean, I don't expect you to know everything from researching a place for 2 weeks. So,
Or if there's like a major, I'm just thinking in mind, like if there was a major event or conflict that's still gonna have some repercussions.
so what she's saying is if there's like a major event or something that had repercussions in the culture, do I want you to talk about that? Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Will I accept a draft for feedback after tonight? So I'm super busy until Thursday, and then I'm getting my car fixed for several hours while I sit at the car shop. So if you get it to me by 10 in the morning on Thursday, there's a very good chance I will still give you feedback. And at the very least, I will, even if I'm super packed and don't have time, I will at least look at it and be like, you're on the right track. This is horrible, you know, or whatever. Not that those would be the two extremes.
Really reconsider your life choices.
Yeah. In fact, you're now out of the program. Yeah. So I will, I know I said I'd only accept it until tonight, but I honestly, I'm not going to be able to look at it until Thursday anyway. So plus only one person sent me their draft. So
It's probably more.
it was warned.
Yeah.
So do you people in the room, oh, there's a word for when your stomach growls. Okay, so is there people in the room that have questions? You guys rocking along on it? What are you drinking? The green,
Oh, that's my green smoothie. Spinach, avocado, green grapes.
I love that.
Yeah.
Sounds healthy.
I love smoothies.
I'm on a green smoothie,
Like a cleanse,
not a cleanse, just more of
kick.
Yeah, kick and making alterations to my diet
Mm.
to help with some health issues. So, but then I eat a cookie, so that's not.
Yes.
Carolyn has a green mason jar. Yeah, so this this one and Heliana's presentation will be recorded and sent to YouTube, where they will be available, and you can.
You need internet sensation.
I'll put it. I can put it to like unlisted or
Oh,
something.
you should have had that.
But I'll put the links up for you. It takes like a day for them to post sometimes. Sometimes it's like within a couple hours, and sometimes it takes a long time. So when I have a moment, I'll post the links to the YouTube videos. Well, you're not even in the video because it's just your voice. I know.
Serious. It's not serious.
So if anybody has questions for the discussion, I posted the directions online. I just took the discussion leaders' questions and posted them on there with the directions. There's 4 different posts. Let's see, someone asked if this would be acceptable. Executive summary, evidence, and graphics and conclusion. If by evidence you mean the cultural schemata and analysis of the culture, then yes. But I don't know what evidence you would be presenting because you're not really making an argument exactly. But, and on the market analysis report thing, I talk about the different sections that you need. Is there a BuzzFeed word for anxiety over the format of your marketing study tech comm paper? No, Darren. I know it's you guys are thinking too much about this. You're thinking too much about this. It's fine.
I'm approaching it. It's like I just need to get something down.
Yeah.
You see it.
Yeah. You're thinking too much about it. Jargarita is what you said about your green thing. Good one, Annie. But yeah, you're putting too much thought. I don't believe you at all. So I'll give another minute for questions and then I'll hang the Google Hangout up. And I'll give everybody in the room the sample market analysis report. Just kidding. Okay, well, I think we set a good precedent for if there's a snow emergency. I'll let everybody know by 2 o'clock in the afternoon if it looks horrible and I'm really going to cancel class. Like I said, I have an all-wheel drive car and there's a good route from my house to here, so I can usually make it. But if something gets really horrible, we'll cancel class. We'll do this Google Hangout thing. We'll figure something out. Okay, people, email me with questions. Oh, there's a lot of reading next week. So finish your marketing report. There's like 10 things to read. It's probably the worst week. So maybe we shouldn't have postponed the marketing report, but life will go on. So start on it now. Okay, bye.